What is up, guys? Tonight we are going to dive into tuning MazdaEdit on the Mazda RX-8. So before we get into that, for those of you that are just tuning into this, Project RX-8, or Project Great Daily, as I like to call it, is my attempts at building the ideal balance of a tuner car and a daily driver. Now, the goals for this build wasn't anything outrageous. It was just a well-rounded, all-around package. I love the Mazda RX-8. I think its suspension engineering is one of the best cars I have ever driven in my entire life. The handling characteristics of the car at the limit are pure bliss. I love the FD. I love my Miatas. I love my S2000. Yes, they maybe produce a little bit more raw mechanical grip than the RX-8. A lot of that could just be because the RX-8 is just a heavier car all around. But the way that suspension is engineered on that RX-8, it is probably one of the most blissful cars compared to all the others. So I love the thing, and I wanted to make it into the ideal daily for me. The cars are definitely underrated in today's market, and they're definitely a hidden gem. And it's actually like a really, really nice car. The interior on these cars is like, it's just a nice place to be, especially for long trips. So the build itself up to this point is a little bit of suspension stuff. It's got Tane Flex Z coilovers, which I'm probably not keeping for those of you looking for an update on those. They're probably going to get switched to something like Olin's down the road. I don't love those shocks. The valving, everything is okay, but the rears bottom out like way too easily. The RX-8 is kind of more of a long travel car. I hit the bump stops on them like no problem. So I don't like that. I shouldn't be hitting bump stops on the car. But suspension, wheels, Enki Kojin 18 by 9.5, positive 30 front and rear, 255, 35/18 tires front and rear. Body's all stock. Engine, cold air intake, filter in the front bumper. Don't know if you can see that very well, but it's there. Has a exotic speed exhaust manifold, which you're not going to be able to see because this is a modern car and the packaging is tight as shit. Made it to a catless mid-pipe using the OEM catback exhaust to keep the noise levels down. Overall, this provides a pretty good balance of flow, but keeping the noise in the drone at a minimum. I was looking into replacing the rear section with something that would flow a little bit better, but the trade-off in weight and potential drone kind of turned me off, so that's why I'm still running the stock catback. For reliability, it has a Sone oil metering adapter. So I'm using Idemitsu premix in my reservoir here. No longer pulling oil from the factory oil pan. I have a set of Bennett built GM LS D585 ignition coils, the whole kit from Bennett built. Mazdas have a notorious issue for ignition coils. I've talked about this in the past. A lot of issues with these cars stem from the ignition coils. The factory battery has been factory size batteries are gone. I'm running a Shorai. I don't remember the model, but this is the largest capacity battery that they offer. It's like 540 cold cranking amps. It's a lithium ion battery. It only weighs 4.8 pounds. Modified battery box to accommodate this. Factory air pump is gone and removed with the header installation. I forgot to add that before just to clean up the engine bay here. So these mods offer some performance, some reliability, and some weight reduction. One other thing I guess that's worth noting is I have a Nardi classical steering wheel and the factory airbag is gone. A little bit more weight reduction there. So what does this all equate to? It's definitely made the car feel a little bit faster at the seat of the pants. Adding the header yielded a noticeable gain. I don't know what it is yet. I haven't taken this car to a dyno or anything. I don't really care that much, but there was definitely a seat of the pants gain by adding the header. The reduced weight definitely makes a difference as well. And I really like the fact that I'm no longer pulling oil from my factory crankcase and I'm just running the Idemitsu premix. So that's about the extent of the mods that are going on this car. I got a couple other like little tiny things in mind. One of them being lightweight pulleys. Ooh. Lightweight pulleys. But from here, I'm kind of milking it a little bit more. It's just going to be small stuff. There's nothing major. The point is to keep the thing reliable. I bought this car with 22,000 miles on it. It now has about 39,000 on the clock, and it's still running strong. I don't see there were any issues with compression. Compression was good when I bought it. It has no problem starting. For those of you who want a update on the Shorai, it's been in the car since I think around March or maybe February I installed it. Been running it daily. It could sit for a few days, no problem. It's recommended if the car is going to sit for longer than 2 weeks to plug the tender in on it, which is what I do. But I've been driving it now that the weather's warm, so no issues there. We'll see what happens in the wintertime. But that battery cranks this thing like super hard, way harder than the acid unit that it replaced ever did. So the final thing to tie this all together is MazdaEdit. And this is kind of a new dynamic for me because all of my cars from the past, Turbo Miata, ITB Miata, S2000, FD, they're all on standalone ECUs. So there's no factory components left there. But at the cost of throwing emissions out the window, there's some measures I have to take for cars like the S2000, which is no longer which is not emissions compliant with that ECU because it outputs no OBD2 readiness. But I'm fortunate enough I can just throw the stock ECU back in that car, drive it around through one cycle, set all the readiness monitors, go to emissions and pass, take the ECU back out and put my Haltech, which is what I run in there, Haltech Plug and Play Platinum Pro. The RX-8, I almost am tempted to go with a standalone at this point. I think Haltech makes a solution, but I just don't know how plug and play it is. Here's what I've learned so far diving into this with the RX-8. The RX-8 is a very complicated car, and I think this was known. I've heard about possible dyno issues where the ECU doesn't, when it senses the front wheel's not spinning, it thinks you're kind of doing like a massive burnout and puts the car into almost like a limp mode, or it richens it up like crazy. I didn't want to do sketchy stuff to get it through emissions. That was important. I just wanted to be able to drive to emissions and pass. So the price for MazdaEdit was very cheap. I want to say the plug-in unit that you have to get, the tack tricks here, and to flash the ECU as well as the MazdaEdit software itself, it was like just shy of $400 if I remember correctly. I bought it like 6 months ago, so I don't remember the exact price. But the ECU, because you are dealing with the stock ECU, you retain all the OBD2 functionality. You can output readiness. You can keep all that. So that was kind of the thing that lured me to it. Plus the price. You know what I mean? The price is nice, and when you're working off of the factory ECU, you have all the drivability stuff like kind of already in place, and all the temperature corrections and stuff are like set really well. When you do a standalone, you have to go and tune all that stuff by yourself, or from scratch, I should say. And it takes a long time to get a car on a standalone running optimally, and like the real key is having factory-like drivability. That's probably one of the most difficult things when it comes to really modifying a car, is making it drive like a stock car. And I didn't really want to do that on my daily. I've done it, and I know what it takes. It's a lot of time tuning on the street, tuning everything, and even then, so like my cars are pretty good. They're put together pretty well, but there is still some like little drivability niggles that I don't love. And that's just kind of like the small price that you have to pay by going with a standalone. On the bright side, though, is that you get to do it. You get to do whatever you want. You get to tell what you want exactly for timing, what you want for fueling in every condition. And if it works well, it's because you made it work well. And if it doesn't work well, it's because you didn't make it work well. But like it's exactly what you give it. So this is what we started to learn so far with the RX-8 tuning it. Is this car, like I said, is very complicated. Essentially, think of MazdaEdit as a piggyback, right? Because you are still dealing with a lot of the factory parameters that are in there with the OEM ECU. So when you're trying to override them, and as we have discovered, is that the car will still fight you and it will still do what it wants. Like it's almost like this ECU setup is like a little bit idiot proof. You can't really like fuck it up because the car will still do. If you do something that's drastically outside of what it wants, it won't care and it'll just do whatever it wants anyways. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a few moments. So in the past, I've shown our method of tuning a car. We take it out on the street, we go through the map, and we go through each cell by holding the brake and using the accelerator. So if we need to hold it at a certain RPM to match a certain load, to tune a certain cell, that's the method that we use. We do this on the street, it simulates real world conditions, and there's no change from a dyno, the load that a dyno applies versus when you go to the street, which happens. There's a little bit of a load difference going from dyno to street. After we tune on the dyno, we get our numbers, but when we put it back on the street, we go out and retune again because oftentimes the load's a little bit different and the tune changes a little bit. It's just how it goes. So I'm going to show you a quick clip of us doing a brake holding thing so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Plug this in right now. So that's the method that we use. What we discovered with the RX-8 is that it doesn't like that. So there's another challenge, is that because this is ECU flashing, you can't write changes on the fly. So a lot of people, they use the data logging function, which we'll go into that a little bit more also as we continue down the video. But this is very frustrating because when we check a cell, we were writing down on a little notepad in the car, like a digital notepad, literally the program notepad. I was marking down at what RPM, and we were mostly tuning the wide open throttle stuff. All the mid-range and everything and the drivability is actually really good on the stock ECU. There's really not too much to be had there with timing or anything else. So we didn't really like delve into touching it. But also because if we really wanted to tune all those cells, this thing would take like months to tune, like literally months. We've put about 10 hours into the tune already, and like a lot of it was like just ramp up time, like learning how the ECU functions. So there was a lot, we're learning like the ins and outs of the ECU, so that like took a little bit of time. But when we make changes now, we can't see how they're affecting the car. We actually have to pull the car over and shut it off, write the ECU. I'll show you the whole flash procedure for those of you guys who want to see this stuff. And actually, I'm probably thinking now that this may be worth breaking this video down into a couple different components so we can really cover everything appropriately, because I want to do this a little bit right, because I think there's a lot of questions about MazdaEdit, how it operates, and this may be helpful to like really just kind of take our time. I know these become a little bit tedious, but it'll probably better to take our time to really go through things step by step to kind of like really give you guys as best of an explanation as I can. Not an expert, definitely not an expert. Neither is my tuner buddy, but we've done quite a bit and we have enough background to, not to make a car safe and not have it blow up. The cars have been running very, very well, fully tuned. And I'm not easy on them, let's face it. So, having to pull over and write the changes to the ECU and then go back out and then check those cells again to see the effects that it had. If you're off, then you gotta do the thing all over again and you gotta go and change the values again. The numbers in the ECU are kind of arbitrary. They look like they were trying to do AFRs, and I'll show you that in the fuel maps, but they're not. Because some of them, like where it would say like 11.2 or 12.8 or whatever when we actually checked that cell. It wasn't. Some of them are though. If you look at a lot of the cruise cells, which they like Mazda tune the RX-8 in all the low end and like just like kind of like moderate mid-range, everything under 4,000 RPM for the most part is tuned for fuel economy. Stock ECU actually runs pretty lean, runs in the 14s for a lot of the drivability, but the downfall of that is when you floor the car at a low RPM, it just doesn't go anywhere because there's no fuel. So there, we did play around with like adding a little, where we tried, I should say, we tried to add fuel down in the lower RPM range to like give it a little bit more low end, but the stock ECU is like it doesn't do anything. And a lot of this is because where the open loop versus closed loop changeover is. Open loop being, I may be reversing this, but I always forget open loop versus closed loop. But I believe open loop is when you're off of the O2 sensor for the tune, and that's all the like idle, low end, low RPM. That's all open loop. And there's a load point too where you would go to closed loop, and then closed loop is your tune cells. Like that's your map. That's like basically the parameters programmed into the ECU is your closed loop. So trying to improve the like down low power, down low drivability and everything, it was kind of fighting us. We were trying to change the values for when it goes from open to closed loop, and rather read off of our map versus doing what the O2 readings were. But even that, we still kind of didn't really have any good results. It was still kind of fighting us, and it was lean. You floor the car 2,500 RPM, and it's like your 14 whatever's AFRs, which is like, it's lean. It's lean for like if you want to like actually make the car go. So because it doesn't have that fuel, it doesn't pick up very well. So that's one thing. Like I said, we left mid-range alone. So a lot of the areas of focus was just in the top end. It's the wide open throttle cells from like 4,000 RPM to redline. And the other thing that we learned is that up there, Mazda has the car very rich. And I don't know if they did this to maybe cool the combustion chamber down a little bit by adding some extra fuel. But whatever the case is, the car goes very rich, especially up top. We were seeing air fuel ratios in the 11s, which is like too rich for a naturally aspirated vehicle. In most cases, on my NA builds, wide open throttle and like towards redline is typically around 12.8 is the air fuel ratio that we go for. 13:1 is like pretty good for peak power, naturally aspirated in most cases, but it's right there on the edge. So we typically do 12.8 to leave a little bit of a margin of error in case a correction is off or it's just hotter that day. And again, the correction is not working correctly. Whatever the case is, there's a little bit of meat on the table. So the car isn't like right on the edge of like a detonation threshold or like being too lean. Now with that said, the Renesys, the way that Mazda designed the ports, the intake and exhaust ports, is that there's like literally no overlap from intake and exhaust in the combustion cycle. Older 13Bs, actually every older rotary that was not the Renesys, which uses the side exit exhaust through the irons versus out the rotor housing like the traditional ones, there's no overlap in them. All the older ones, everything that has a peripheral exit exhaust has overlap. So that's part of the reason why we think the engine can get away with the leaner air fuel ratios and the drivability and everything else. So like Mazda doing that wasn't just for noise, but it was also for fuel economy, being able to run leaner and emissions and all that stuff. So that's one of the other things to make note of. We did feel a seat of the pants gain. Again, it's hard to feel changes on the street. So we're not done tuning this thing. But on the street, we leaned out the top end a little bit. So we were bringing like wide open throttle up to 9,000, air fuel ratios in the in the 12s range. So we were getting 12.5, 12.7, like so, like like in that vicinity. It's hard to get it perfect on this car just because of the time that it takes when you keep pulling over, flashing the ECU, and then rewriting it. It definitely adds a little bit of a challenge there. But again, a 0.2 difference or whatever is not really going to make that much in the grand scheme of things. It's not that big of a deal. Another thing that we notice is that, and if you guys who have RX-8s and you're on the stock ECU, if you cruise fast on the highway on these things, so I think it was about 82 miles an hour on my speedometer, but my speedometer reads higher than what the car actually is because of the overall diameter of those wheel and tire package that I have. So there's probably like more like 80 miles an hour, 79, 78, it's somewhere in that vicinity. But once you go over that RPM, even at like a light cruise on the highway, the tune goes pig rich. So like you literally go, like will be cruising at like 11, like in the 11s to 1 air fuel ratios. And in terms of gas mileage, it probably like tanks your gas mileage. So if you cruise fast on the highway, keep that in consideration, that the stock tune richens the fuck out of the car. Now I think, and here's the thing, we didn't change that. And here's why. Because these cars have a notorious issue in a road racing, sustained high RPM situation where the side seals, which run close to the exhaust, with the exhaust port changes on this car, and they overheat and then they fail prematurely. And I've known a bunch of people who campaigned RX-8s from my grassroots days racing Spec Miata, and they talked about side seal failures quite a bit. So I think Mazda richened the stock tune to be at a higher RPM like that, to be richer, to cool those seals down. So that extra fuel will keep the temps down a little bit and prolong their life. So from a standpoint of, for a track day car or a road race car, I really don't think the RX-8 is a great candidate. That sucks. I couldn't recommend it. As a daily, I think a daily's fine because you're not up there all the time. It's okay if you're up there like going through the gears or like driving Spirited for a couple minutes, but like if you're gonna go out and do a 30-minute track session, I think that would become a problem. So that's another thing that we noticed tuning the car. So MazdaEdit is good for a couple other things. I know I'm talking down about it a lot. You know, how much meat, like before I go into the positives. So really what it comes down to is I don't think that we're getting all the meat on the table using this ECU because the factory ECU kind of overrides it. And I didn't even really explain that. So when we brake hold the car, brake holding this car versus going through the gears, like, so we started using the data logging function. If you go, and we're watching it real time too. If you floor this thing through the RPM range, it doesn't go like pig rich. It'll actually like use what we tuned. But when you start to apply brake to brake hold the car, it richens up. And I'm gonna demonstrate that right now. So you saw, by just accelerating through the gears freely, the air fuels are where we wanted them to be from tuning. But as soon as we would hold the brake if we were trying to fine tune those cells, the car goes pig rich. And this kept getting us over and over again. We're like, what the hell? We thought that we leaned it out enough, but then when we would check it, like just not, like I said to him, I was like, let's just do a full throttle pull and just see what it does. I'm curious. Because every time we would check those cells holding the brake, the tune would go rich. And we're like, we kept pulling fuel, but when we went through the map, or like just like floored it and actually went to red line without holding the brake at all, the car was lean, so we had to add fuel again. And that makes this very difficult to tune. There's a couple things to take into consideration. When you're in a cell, before you get like a very accurate reading, there's always like a little bit of a delay for the exhaust to like hit the sensor to process it, the sensor to send it through the harness to whatever you're trying to output that reading to, and then you matching that to where you are in the fuel map or timing map, either one. That makes this very difficult. So there's definitely something going on where when the ECU senses that the brake sensors or whatever, their brake sensors or wheel speed sensors, somehow the thing knows that you're braking. I think there's a brake pedal sensor or two on the pedal assembly. I haven't looked, but there must be. It changes. It thinks that something's going on. Why it richens up the car, I don't know. We don't know. That's kind of a mystery. But not being able to brake hold the car and stay in a cell and get an accurate reading makes this like very, very difficult to tune. So that's where like the data logging function kind of comes in. So you can see like where you're at for an air fuel ratio when you went through there. And I guess that like kind of helps. It's just not the method of tuning that we were really used to, because there's one benefit of doing it the way that we do it that you don't get when you data log, is that one, you can hear, you can listen to what the engine's doing, you can hear detonation, you can feel if the engine's running rough, if there's too much timing. You don't get that when you're reviewing a data log. The data that you get from a data log is awesome. I think that's great to have, because you see every scenario, what sensors were outputting, what conditions there were, temperature sensors, throttle position sensors. You get all that data like freeze frame per RPM per load, and that's very useful, but you don't get the things that I still think are required to tuning a car properly, and that's the listen and the feel what the motor's doing, how it's responding to the changes that you're making. Every motor likes things a little bit different. Some can run a little bit more timing advanced, some than others, and a lot of it comes down to how the engine is engineered, rod to stroke ratio, there's a whole bunch of factors. How well the heads flow. I mean, I know we're talking rotary here, so it doesn't have rod to stroke and it doesn't have a cylinder head, but like all that stuff dictates what you can run. There's no plug and play number for a specific engine. No, you know what I mean? So every tune is essentially unique. So that's another thing that we encountered and made this like very difficult to manage. But what we did found that actually added a little bit of seat of the pants power is leaning out those upper fuel cells. We even bumped timing a little bit in the wide open throttle range by 2 degrees. We found pretty good results. Again, seat of the pants, sound, you can hear the engine got just peppier. I always notice that the stock power band like really starts to kind of taper off by like 8,500. And now after tuning, this thing pulls strong right up to 9,000, which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing for a daily, because again, going to the whole corner seal thing on these cars, they don't, in that high RPM. So that's where we're at as far as tuning the car. I was going to go over all the benefits of using the MazdaEdit, but this video is already much longer than I was anticipating it to be. But I think that it's important to talk about these points when looking at this ECU. So I'm just going to kind of briefly talk about some of the things that we did for reliability and like just some of the cool things that the MazdaEdit has to offer versus going with a standalone. So we'll take a look at those now, and then I think we're going to talk a little bit more advanced tuning stuff in probably part 2 for this. So I'm going to leave you off with one more thing. All the changes that we made, this is the street portion of it, right? There's a couple things that we didn't really mess with. We didn't bump timing or change timing anymore, because those little changes, you can't really tell by seat of the pants whether or not the car is responding well to it or not. You could feel if the motor's getting more rough, the more advanced you run, which in case, from a reliability standpoint, you want to back it off a little bit, but you really need a dyno to change the timing a little bit and see what the ultimate effect of it is having in terms of power and everything else. So that's one of the things that we're going to be testing when we bring the car to the dyno. Number 2 is the D585 coils, I think, want more dwell timing. Dwell timing being the time that it takes to charge the coil before the spark occurs. Mazda stock coils require less dwell time to fully charge versus the D585s. So that's, again, I plugged these in, ran them on the stock ECU. I know there was a lot of questions about that in the past. Could you run those ignition coils without making any changes to stock? And it ran fine. I don't know if it's running optimal, but like it ran without any hiccups, let's put it that way. So when we're on the dyno, that's another thing that we can do. We can increase the dwell times of the ignition coils and see if that strengthens the spark and maybe produces a more efficient combustion and makes a little bit more power. We're not going to feel that on the street. So that's why we didn't even bother changing dwell timing yet for the coils. That's just going to be something that we change on the dyno and see what it does. So I'm going to show you guys some of the basic stuff that you can do, and I'm trying to think if I want to like wrap this up, now because we've already delved into this a little bit too much. I know this is going to be a long video. All right, I'm going to show you just a couple of the quick things, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more in depth, and we'll go into everything more detail on part 2, and that will be like the advanced tuning stuff, and we'll talk about timing, fueling, and all that other stuff too in that second part. But we'll go over what we've changed as far as like reliability stuff and the cool things that MazdaEdit can do. All right, guys, so here we are in the MazdaEdit interface. I'm not connected to the car right now, but the procedure would be you connect the dongle, the Tactrix dongle, to the OBD2 port, connect it to the USB in your laptop. You come and open up your ROM file that you're going to edit. So here you can see a couple of files that we use. This is the original one I got back from the developer. I'm keeping that as like the fail-safe if I ever need to revert back to fully stock. Here's our first modified one, and here's one before we made a lot of changes to other tables. So I'm just going to open up this one for now. So once you get this open, you'll get your list of maps here. And just bear with me because I'm standing behind the camera, trying to look through the camera to see exactly what I am doing. So we'll just go right down the list here. The closed loop, max load A, B, and C. This is a little bit confusing, but this is where we tried to force the car into closed loop sooner versus and improve the lower end. But even by messing with these on all 3 maps, it didn't really seem to do us much benefit. Maybe somebody who's done this before can chime in and add some input on how to do that. We also changed the max RPM and as well, trying to bring that down, and it didn't really seem to help us very much. Didn't touch cranking pulse width because the car starts right up, no problems. Didn't mess with the drive-by-wire throttle. This is something that we may change a little bit. Mazda's really notorious for, I don't even know, I'm not sure how they correlate the values in here, but Mazda's really notorious for gearing their throttle plates to open fully much sooner than when you're actually giving full throttle. And I think they do that to kind of give a false sense of speed because the car picks up quicker, but that's just in fact because with less pressing of the gas, you're actually opening up the throttle plate farther than what you think you're doing. DTCs. So remember I said I removed my factory air pump assembly. So from what I was told is that DTC list optional is one that you don't mess with. That's some developer thing. But if you want to shut off a cell, or you want to shut off the parameters that check for a certain condition to throw a check engine light or an engine code, you disable it in maps 1 and 2 here for DTC. So I'm going to use this as an example. I didn't touch any of this stuff down here. The codes I was getting for deleting the air pump assembly. Again, I don't have a catalytic converter anymore, so I don't need the air pump. And the air pump just takes up a lot of space, plus its weight, yada, yada, yada. The codes that I was getting was a P0410 and a P0411. So 01 as the value is for yes, active, check for this. 00 is do not check for this any longer. So sure enough, I changed these to 00. Check engine light went away and has not come back. It would come back for sure 100% cold startup in the morning before I go to work, which is when the air pump really needs to come on because the car has to run more rich on the startup map. So it tries to get the cat up as quickly as possible to prevent it from getting clogged by excess fuel and everything else. Plus it also helps the cat start catalyzing the exhaust faster. So I've been driving the car a week with the tuned map on it, and these disabled, no signs of that check engine light coming back or those cell codes. So that's pretty cool. Engine. auxiliary port valves that are inside the intake system or the intake manifold. This is another thing that really complicates the RX-8. There's like 4 valves that all open at different times, and there has been a history of these things not functioning properly, causing horsepower drops in the car. So here you can kind of change the RPM that certain valves actuate at. We did not touch any of this stuff, but this is one of the frustrating parts for the RX-8 because it's got like 4 VTECs basically happening. Essentially, though, it's not VTEC, right? Because the RX-8 doesn't have cams, but these 4 valves like opening at different times, you feel them, and you can feel like when the car like actually like a lot, if you pay attention to it, you can feel when they open, and you can feel like the bump that the car will get because it's increasing the airflow. It's really complicated. This is one thing that I can see there being problems with if I were to switch to a standalone ECU on the car, is I don't know what you do with this stuff. I think you're gonna have to either delete it and run it open, but it's probably gonna cost you drivability and whatnot down low. Radiator fan temperatures. So this is another thing that we changed. I lowered this. I believe the radiator fan is set to come on at 211 degrees Fahrenheit, which is kind of hot. Pretty much anything over 220 water temp, I think, as you like, especially like 230 is like when things start to get too hot. So coming on at 211 degrees, it puts you closer to that 220 threshold, which I think is where like the overheating threshold would start to occur for a rotary. So I lowered this to 200. How much of a difference this is actually going to make, I don't know. It's really got to be only for like stop and go traffic. I will say this, monitoring water temperature, even like when the car was like sitting at idle and we were getting a lot of heat soak, it doesn't really run as hot as like I was made to believe by reading a lot about the car. It seems like the cooling system on the RX-8 actually works pretty damn well. So I did drop these a little bit to 200 just to see what it does. I didn't touch the vehicle speed fan and the radiator 2 fan. So and actually, now that I'm looking at this, these might have been 207 degrees, but I think it was 211 if I remember correctly. Didn't change anything with the fuel injector scaling because these are still stock injectors in here. Fuel maps. These are the 2 fuel maps that we were working with. And like this is kind of silly too. It has gear 1 and 2 fuel map, gear 3 and 4 fuel map, and gear 5 and 6 fuel map. I don't know why it has 3 fuel maps. And you can see here the gear 5 and 6 fuel map is not even available. If you open this up, the values are all over the place. This is like just horseshit. It's nothing. Like you would never be able to run the car properly with this. So we're working mostly with these fuel maps, the gear 3 and 4, and it seemed like it didn't really matter. Gears 3 and 4, whatever we tuned here, we got similar air fuels on gears 1 and 2 without even copying these values to the gears 1 and 2 map. Gears 5 and 6 naturally seem to run a little bit richer than these, and I think that again that's an output of the factory ECU. On all of my standalones, we deal with 1 fuel map for every gear, so it's just wherever you are, like you can maybe hit different load areas in certain gears versus having individual fuel maps for it. So I don't know why MazdaEdit is set up like this. And originally, when you look at this, especially because down in these lower drivability cells here, so we have RPM up at the top, engine load right here, right? So your full throttle stuff would be down here, full load. And as you go up in RPM, you'll see your tracker go up this way. But if you look at all these cells, they're 14.7. So it makes you kind of believe that this is that's an air fuel ratio, because this is where the car mostly tries to run for. And I think that there is a little bit of an algorithm here where it tries to hit these values to some extent. But you can see here in our wide open throttle cells, which this is where we spent most of the time tuning, was from here over the last 5 cells, right? So you could see we have 11.9, 10.54, 11.44. Now this actually, it's not this rich here. In fact, this is actually kind of lean. This is still lean here. Around this 4,000 mark, if I remember correctly, we were still hitting like close to like 14 air fuel ratio, which tuning a naturally aspirated engine, and especially tuning for like long-term reliability, but also like usability and like better download power, 14:1 full load, 4,000 RPM is just like way too lean. And this is where I was going back to, where the car just like doesn't want to go It was mostly in this range right here, 2,500 to 3,500 RPM. If you floor the car down here, it just like doesn't want to freaking go because it's just so lean. There's not enough fuel. It wasn't pinging or anything, but this has got to be for gas mileage. Mazda did this for the efficiency of it, but it also like sucks because it ruins low-end drivability a little bit. Like I said, 10.54, we were definitely not getting these air-fuel ratios. It wasn't this rich. So that's why it just kind of leads me to believe that these values are arbitrary. They don't mean anything. It's just a guess. But when we ended up when the wide open throttle, like I said, was mostly in the 12 range, mid 12s, right in that vicinity, which is fine. Lower RPM at full throttle, 4,500, 5,000. They may be a little bit richer there. Just because there's more load on the engine. It doesn't have the momentum. It has to work a little bit harder. You're adding max fuel for max combustion at this point, but the engine just has to work a little bit harder because it doesn't have its natural momentum of the RPM. So, these cells may be a little bit more richer under full load versus 6,500 and up, where the engine has that momentum and it doesn't have to work as hard to make the power. And you can lean it out a little bit, and this is where you can maybe advance timing a little bit more as well, and you'll see that in the timing maps too. So this is kind of what we changed for fuel stuff. We'll go into this more in detail in the next one, and again, we're not done. We'll do the final thing after dyno, and we'll see what the end results ultimately end up being. Idle stuff I didn't have to touch because the car with the MazdaEdit drives like a stock car, which is really good. And I guess that's one of the other things I should stress is that if you're not really confident in tuning, but you want to get a good start, this is a pretty safe way, I think, to start. Obviously don't just go making changes that you don't know what you're changing, but it just seems like there's a lot of fail safes in here that the stock ECU will still kind of do what it wants to do. No matter what, so it's kind of hard to really screw it up, I think. Let's see, we didn't touch any of the idle timing stuff either. Again, all the stock stuff to make this car have stock-like drivability is really good. That's a huge benefit for this. So the timing maps are stuff that we did play around with, but I'm not going to go into these too much right now. We'll talk about this more. Leading timing for your leading spark plugs in the rotary, when these spark, at what degree before top dead center, and the same thing here with trailing. So you have two timing maps for rotary versus one of a normal piston car. But like I was saying before, if you look at full load, low RPM, look at the timing advance. It's like nothing, right? Engine spinning slower, so you don't want to start that ignition too early. And there's more load here, so your timing tables you just run less timing advance. But you can see as the engine gets faster and faster, you can run more advance. One, because you need to, right? You need to get that spark started a little bit sooner because of how quickly the engine's spinning to optimize when the spark occurs to continue to propel the rotor and the power stroke. But you could see the high timing settings are in the last of the RPM range, but also take note that under lighter load you can advance timing even more. So that's why up here max RPM with no throttle load, the timing values are even more advanced. Look at we have 45 degrees, 43 degrees or whatever, but more than most likely you are not going to be up here in this range anyways. So I certainly don't. I never just drive the car at light throttle that high RPM. But and again, you can advance timing this much because there's less load, right? So there's less air because you're pressing the gas less, right? So the spark, it's not as easy for the ignition to happen because there's just less oxygen in the combustion area. That's why the timing is much more advanced under light throttle up in this area. Again, we'll talk about this more. We did change the timing split a little bit, which is the split between leading and trailing timing, and we'll talk about that more in the advance. And let's go back down. So ignition, we have our dwell settings here. This is the stock Mazda dwell settings that came programmed in the MazdaEdit. And I think these are the factory parameters. If somebody wants to chime in for this, excuse me, to kind of explain a little bit more what these values actually are. I don't think, typically dwell is rated in milliseconds. And it would almost make sense if this was 3.95 milliseconds, but at 9,000 RPM, you really don't have 3.9 milliseconds to charge that coil to spark. So that tells me that these values are something else. But if somebody has a correction, or a conversion, I should say, a conversion factor that I can apply to this to understand what these values would be in milliseconds, that would be fantastic. Please post it below. I'll give you a hug if you're local. Thank you. So moving on from ignition, and let's see, leading time RPM, I didn't touch any of that. Didn't touch the rev limiter, left it at 9,000. Speed limiter, oh, there's a speed limiter. I don't know what these values are. I see 180, 240, 211. I don't even know if the RX-8 has enough power to max itself out, so I'm not even gonna bother with that for now. But that's just about it. And these other, oh, I'm sorry, one more. Oil injection. Series 1 RX-8s are supposedly have too little oil injection. This is your oil metering. So one of the things that we did also was we bumped these. I don't even know what we should bump these to, but I think we did from 40, I want to see if I remember correctly, it was from 44 down. We bumped this 5. Again, I think these are just arbitrary values, and then the rest of the map, we bumped it up by 7. Somebody can chime in if there's like an actual calculation for what this is doing, but it's more than stock. But we didn't want to go crazy because we don't want to just be dumping a shitload of premix into there. But that seemed to be more. I appreciate any input there, and that's just about it. So those are all. That's everything that we went through for maps. We can talk about the burn procedure and everything else in the next video. I'll connect the laptop to the car and I'll show you the readouts that you get. Again, I'm not connected to the car right now, so if I come in here, I'm not going to have any of my output parameters or anything like that. And we'll talk about the data logs and we'll go into them more in depth in the next video as well. So that is it for this one, guys. I know this was lengthy, but I think it's important to cover all these details, and I hope that answers some of your questions about what's kind of involved with MazdaEdit for the Mazda RX-8. A lot of what we're talking about here, other than leading and trailing ignition timing, would apply to other versions of MazdaEdit for piston cars. So I hope that helps, and I hope that you guys appreciate and enjoy this. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them below. I will do my best to answer them. As always, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. If you like this sort of stuff, please comment, please like and subscribe. And this helps me determine what content to produce for the channel. And every time you interact with any of the videos, like, subscribe, share, it boosts them and it helps the YouTube algorithm get them out there and get these in front of more viewers. And it greatly helps me out. So I greatly do appreciate that. Thank you guys very much. Till next time, done.